Today I want to share with you a story filled with hardship, courage, and unexpected love. It begins with a woman who had lost everything, wandering alone under the desert sun. Fate placed in her path a man whose silence carried the weight of old wounds. What followed tested both their strength and their hearts in ways neither could have imagined. Now let us begin the story. The Arizona sun had been burning since dawn, hammering the desert with a white heat that shimmered off the rocks. By late afternoon, the light turned copper, and the wind came alive, lifting dust from the flats into sparring fingers that clawed at the skiing bay. Emma Wade pulled her bonnet tighter, but it was no use. The wind bit through fabric, flung sand into her eyes, scoured her lips until they bled. She had been walking since morning. Her boots were worn thin. The soles cracked from weeks of travel. The canteen on her hip rattled empty. Its last drops gone before noon. Each step dragged heavier than the last, her satchel cutting against her shoulder like a stone weight. Emma had come west with nothing but a threadbare hope. Back in Missouri, her family had pressed her toward a marriage she could not stomach. A union meant to mend debts rather than hearts. She had refused, and for that refusal she had been cast out. No home, no dowry, no place at the table she had grown up at. When she heard of an uncle in Arizona, she thought perhaps Providence had left her one chance. But when she reached Clearwater Junction, a sunburned settlement, no bigger than a clap of hands, the news struck her flat. The uncle had been dead 2 years, his homestead burned in a raid. She had lingered one night at the saloon, her few coins buying a stale meal and a cot. The way the innkeepers has lingered, told her all she needed to know if she stayed. She would be bought and sold like whiskey. At dawn she gathered her satchel and walked into the desert. She thought she could reach Copper Bend, a settlement 2 days east. Foolish thought. By late day, the wind rose into a fury. Dust rolled over the flats in waves, blotting the horizon. The sun turned to a red coin behind the storm. Emma coughed until her throat scraped raw, her lungs burning as if she had swallowed fire. Her bonnet whipped loose and was gone, her hair tangled with sand. She staggered, knees buckling. At last she spotted a circle of stones, the remains of an old well. She fell beside it, clutching at the bucket, half buried in sand. Dry, only dust, nothing more. Her vision swam, edges darkening. She thought dimly. This is where I'll die. The desert will swallow me, and no one will ever know my name again. Then a shadow fell over her. She blinked against the grit. A figure stood tall and solid against the storm. Broad shoulders wrapped in deerskin, long black hair bound at the nape with a strip of leather. A rifle lay cradled in his hand. Easy as though it were part of him. His face carved with lines of sun and wind, was unreadable, his eyes dark. Steady studied her without hurry. Emma tried to speak, but only a croak came. She lifted her empty canteen, shaking it weakly. The man crouched without a word, pulled a water skin from his belt, and held it to her lips. She drank in greedy gulps, water spilling down her chin until he drew it away with a firm hand. Enough, he said, his voice low, carrying even against the storm. Too much, and you'll be sick. It was the first kindness she had heard in weeks, though his tone bore no softness, only certainty. His words carried an accent unfamiliar, deliberate, apache, she realized. Her pulse quickened. Fear prickled at her skin, but relief deeper still. He glanced toward the storming horizon, then slung his rifle across his back. Without a word, he bent and lifted her in his arms as though she weighed nothing more than a child. She tried to protest, to insist she could walk, but her body betrayed her. Her head fell against his shoulder. Through the roar of sand and wind, she heard his steady breathing. The firm cadence of his steps on the desert floor. They came at last to a ridge where a half-built cabin clung to the shelter of cottonwoods. Smoke curled faint from a fire pit. The men shouldered open the rough-hewn door and carried her inside, laying her gently on a cot of pine poles and blankets. Emma blinked in the dim light. The cabin was plain, unfinished, but it was not savage. Tools hung on the wall in neat order. A bow and quiver rested above the door. On the table lay strips of leather, half-shaped into reins or moccasins. A clay jug sat beside the fire, half-filled with water. The air smelled of smoke and cedar. The man poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank slower this time, forcing her trembling hand to steady. "Thank you," she whispered, voice ragged. He gave no reply. He took a stool by the wall, rifle resting across his knees, and watched her as the storm screamed outside. "My name is Emma Wade," she said at last, her voice steadier. "From Missouri." The silence stretched. "You saved my life," she tried again. "I owe you." After a long moment, he spoke. "Dan." The name was as spare and strong as the man himself. Emma nodded faintly. "Dan." She clutched her satchel to her chest. He was trying to reach Copper Bend. "Doubt that could make it." He studied here. Eyes narrowed slightly in thought. "Copper Bend is 2 days by foot. You wouldn't have seen morning." The bluntness stung sharper than sand. She looked at her torn dress, her blistered hands. Once she had been the daughter of a merchant with a piano in the parlor. Now she was a beggar dragged from the desert. The sun rose and crossed to the fire. He stirred the coals, set another log to flame. In the firelight, his face showed clearer, strong features, younger than she expected, perhaps 30, but bearing the weight of a man who had seen too much. His silence was not emptiness, but patience. "You can stay until the storm passes," he said finally. "After that, you go your way." Emma's heart faltered. She had no way. No uncle, no coin, no safe road. And Crowley, her stomach clenched at the thought. Crowley's men might already be hunting her. But how could she tell this stranger? Would he cast her out if he knew trouble followed her steps? "I thank you," she said instead, forcing calm. "That will be enough." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie. The storm outside was only the beginning. She had stepped into a place where her past and his future would not together, where survival itself would demand more than a passing kindness. And though she could not yet see it, the moment she fell beneath his shadow at the well, her life had shifted forever. The storm broke in the night, leaving the land scoured clean by the desert wind. Morning came pale and brittle, the air sharp with the scent of dust and smoke. Emma woke beneath a rough wool blanket, her body aching, but alive. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The roof above her was raw timber. The window a square cut in the wall, the floor no more than packed earth. Then memory returned. The storm, the well, the shadow that had carried her through the chaos. Dan. He was there still, seated near the door, rifle across his knees. He had not slept. His dark eyes followed her as she stirred, yet gave no greeting. Outside, a bird called thinly. The only sound in the stillness. Emma sat up slowly. "I should thank you again," she said, her voice raw from sand and thirst. The sun inclined his head once. The sand she pressed heavy, and she felt clumsy beneath it. Back in Missouri, words had been her armor, polite phrases, social niceties, the practiced speech of a merchant's daughter. Here they meant little. "I'll be on my way soon," she said, though her heart sank as she spoke. The sun set the rifle aside and stood, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a man accustomed to silence. "Where will you go to Copper Bend?" she replied, though the words tasted hollow. He studied her a moment. 2 days by foot if you know the land. Long hair if you don't, you'd not make it alone. Emma bristled, stunned by the plainness of his words. "eBay managed this far." "You nearly died yesterday," he said simply. She could not deny it. Her hands twisted in her lap. She had nowhere to go. No coin, no kin. To admit as much was to bare her throat like prey before a hawk. Chen moved to the table where leather strips lay, lifting one in his hands. "The land is not empty," he said after a time. "It is watched, claimed. If you walk into it alone, you will not last. Men will see you as they see land. Something to be taken." Emma's breath caught. She knew he spoke truth. Crowley's face flashed in her mind. The greedy eyes of the man who had cornered her boy at Clearwater Junction, whispering promises she had no intention of hearing. She had fled before his men could bind her fate. If he found her again, she shivered. Dan's eyes flicked to her, sharp, as though he had caught her thought. "You are running from someone." The words struck her like a blow. She faltered. Her pride wanted silence, but survival forced honesty. Yes, a man wealthy, powerful. He wants what I will not give. Dan's jaw tightened, though his face gave little away. He set the leather down and turned back to her. Then you cannot go to Copper Bend. His men will watch the towns. The desert is wide, but not wide enough to hide a woman alone. Emma's throat dried again. Then what choice do I have? Dan looked at her steadily. The firelight caught in his eyes, and for the first time she thought she saw not just stone there, but weight burdens long carried. "Ye have claim to this land," he said at last. "My father's father lived here before the soldiers came. The government says I must prove it. Live here with a family. Make the land a home." A gesture to the unfinished cabin around them. "So I build. Alone. The claim is weak. But with a wife, the law cannot deny it." Emma blinked. The meaning struck her slow as thunder over distant hills. A wife. Dan did not flinch. On paper only. He will not touch what is not freely given. But the law sees a woman at my side and my land is mine. In return, you have a roof, food, protection. When your danger has passed, you may go. Emma's heart pounded. Marriage to an Apache stranger. The thought was unthinkable, scandalous. In Missouri, it would damn her name beyond all redemption. But Missouri was 1,000 miles behind. Here in the Arizona territory, names and reputations meant little. Here, survival meant everything. She stared down at her torn dress, her blistered hands. Alone, she was nothing more than dust waiting to be scattered. With him, perhaps she might endure. "You ask much," she whispered. Dan's gaze held her steady as a mountain. "I offer much, but I will not ask twice." Emma's chest tightened. Her mind reeled with the weight of choice. To step into such a bargain was madness, yet the desert itself had nearly claimed her, and Crowley's shadow loomed near. A threat she could not outrun. At last, she lifted her chin. "If I agree, there must be conditions." Dan inclined his head. "Speak them." "I will have my own room," she said, voice trembling but firm. "Donne. And a fair say in the household where we live, how we keep it. Reasonable. And when the time comes, if it comes that I wish to leave, you will not keep me by force." Chan's eyes darkened, the weight of old wounds flickering there. For a long breath she thought he might refuse, but then he spoke. "I will not hold what does not wish to stay, but I do not make oaths lightly. Marriage, even in name, is no small thing." Emma nodded slowly, nor is survival. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the hiss of the fire. At last, Dan stepped back as though marking the line they had drawn. "Then it is settled," he said. Emma's breath left her in a shudder. She felt both trapped and freed at once, as though she had leapt from a cliff, and discovered wings in the falling. Outside, the desert lay vast and unforgiving. But within those rough walls, a bargain had been struck, one that would bind two strangers across the gulf of race, culture, and past. A reluctant alliance forged not of love, but of necessity. And yet, as Emma lay back against the cot, her heart would not still. For in the quiet weight of Dason's eyes, she had seen something more than necessity. She had seen a man fighting to hold a place in a world bent on erasing him, and perhaps in his struggle she might find her own. The desert turned gentle after the storm, as if ashamed of the violence it had hurled across the land. Days grew hot, nights sharp with cold, and the sky stretched endless above them, blue by day, jeweled by stars at night. Within that vast silence, Emma and Dawson began the uneasy business of living side by side. The cabin smelled of cedar and smoke, the floor rough under Emma's boots. At first, every creak of the timber, every brush of silence between them felt foreign. She had grown up in rooms filled with chatter, merchants haggling, sisters laughing, pianos echoing late into the evening. Here words were scarce, measured like coin, thus unspoke when needed, and no more is quiet a wall she could not climb. But necessity has a way of stripping credence. The first morning Emma tried to cook from what little stores he had. Cornmeal, beans, dried venison. Her attempt came out thick as paste and near inedible. Dan ate without complaint, though his face betrayed the truth. "You can do better," he said simply. I suppose I'll have to, she answered, stank, but determined. By the third morning, she managed a pan of cornbread that filled the room with warmth. Dan said nothing, only nodded once. But she caught the way he took a second piece. It was victory enough. When he left each dawn, rifle slung across his back. Emma watched him from the porch. He moved with a grace that belonged to the land itself. Every step sure and silent. Sometimes he hunted. Sometimes he worked the frame of the cabin, hauling logs and setting them with a strength that seemed endless. Emma tried to help, though her hands blistered and bled. You are not made for this, he told her once, seeing her palms raw. I am not made for being helpless either, she shot back. He gave her a look, then, not unkind, as though reassessing her. From that day he showed her smaller tasks, shaping pegs, mixing mud for chinking, patching leather. The work steadied her, gave her something to set her pride against. In return, she began teaching him letters. At first, he refused. Words on paper will not stop a man's bullet, he said. No, she countered. But they may stop a man's lies. That struck him, and he agreed. Evenings by the fire, she traced words on rough parchment. Land, clan, cabin. His hand, and used a pen, moved clumsy at first, but his eyes never left the page. Patience lived in him, deeper than she had ever known in another. Within weeks, he could sign his name bold and sure. Dan. One evening, when she praised his progress, he only shrugged. A name on paper does not change what I am. Emma looked at him over the firelight. No, but it proves what you already are. A man with a place. A man who belongs. For the first time she thought she saw a flicker in his eyes. Not pride exactly, but something close. Yet not all was harmony. Their ways clashed more than once. She folded clothing in neat piles. He scattered his belongings where they fell. She wished to scrub the floor to make the cabin proper. He said dust was part of living, not a thing to fight. Once when she tried to clear a hunting spear from the doorway, he snapped sharp. Do not touch what you do not understand. The words cut her. She retreated to the far side of the cabin, anger brimming. Later that night, he spoke softer. That spear is older than me. My father made it. He keep it there so I remember. Emma listened, shame washing through her. He didn't know. You could not, he said simply. But now you do. Bit by bit, their worlds met at edges. She told him once of her father's business back east, the collapse that drove her family to desperation, the marriage they tried to force upon her. She spoke with bitterness, her voice trembling at the memory. Dan listened, his face unreadable until at last he said, You chose freedom. That has a price. You are paying it. But you are alive. Alive. The word struck her deeper than she expected. Nights grew colder as summer waned. They slept in separate corners as agreed, but the walls seemed to draw them closer all the same. Once, when coyotes howled near, Emma woke trembling. Dan stirred the fire higher and sat watch until morning. He said nothing of her fear, but she saw the way he placed his rifle within easy reach of her bed. Another time she tried to fetch water from the creek alone, slipped down the bank, and nearly fell. Dan caught her wrist just as she slid, pulling her up with a strength that left her breathless. For a moment, their faces were close, his hand firm around hers, and she saw something in his eyes she could not name. He let go quickly, stepping back as if distance was a shield. As weeks passed, the rhythm of life bound them. Down to dusk with work. Dusk to night with silence or words halting but true. Emma learned to ride the small dun mare tethered near the cottonwoods. Dustin taught her how to listen for water under stone, how to read the tracks of deer and coyote. In turn, she showed him how to keep accounts in a ledger, how to measure stores so nothing went to waste. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she played a tune on a small harmonica she had carried all the way from Missouri. The notes wavered, rough from disuse, but filled the cabin with a softness that made her throat ache. Dan watched, his face unreadable, until she finished. That is a good sound, he said quietly. It reminds me of home, she whispered. Is this not home? She looked around at the half-built cabin, the bare walls, the desert pressing close, her answer caught in her throat. At last, she said, not yet. The son nodded, as if he understood more than she could admit. And so the days turned. What began as necessity slowly, almost against their will, grew into something more, a rhythm shared, a trust, fragile, but real. Emma no longer felt a stranger in the cabin. She belonged to the work, to the silence, to the unspoken bond forming between them. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the alliance they had forged in desperation was becoming something far harder to name. The first signs came subtle, like crows circling far off in a clear scheme. One morning, 10 found boot tracks near the creek too deep, too careless to be his own. Another evening, the mayor grew restless, hairs flicking at shadows beyond the cottonwoods. Emma noticed the change in him, the way his shoulders tightened, the way he kept his rifle closer at hand, the way his eyes scanned the horizon even as they sat at supper. She asked once, "Do you expect someone?" He only said, "The desert has many eyes," and left it at that. But she knew the memory of Clearwater Junction clung to her like smoke. Jabe Crowley had not given up. Men like him did not release what they believed theirs. Emma feared the moment his reach stretched this far. That fear found voice one late afternoon when a rider appeared at the ridge. Emma was tending the fire when she heard hoofbeats heavy and sure. She froze. The son stepped out, rifle in hand, his stance calm but cold. The rider was a broad man in a fine coat, his hat wide-brimmed, his horse sleek and restless. Even before he spoke, Emma knew Crowley. "Well now," he drawled, reining in at the cabin door. "Didn't they expect to find you so far from town, Miss Wade?" His eyes flicked over her, lingering too long. Then shifted to Dan. "And in the company of a no less." Emma's throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "You have no business here, Mr. Crowley." Crowley chuckled low and cold. "Everything west of Clearwater is of my business, especially when it involves runaways and squatters." Dan did not move. "This land is mine. Crowley is near it. Government might not see it that way, but maybe there's a solution. You hand over the girl and I'll forget I ever saw this cabin." Emma felt her stomach turn. She opened her mouth, but Dan spoke first, his voice even. "She is my wife." The words hung in the air, heavier than the desert heat. Emma's heart stumbled, though she knew it was truth on paper. Crowley's smile twisted. "A wife, is it? Well, isn't that quaint? I'm a sorry girl playing squaw. Do you think that'll stand in court? Do you think folks will side with you over me?" Dan raised his rifle a fraction. "Not timing, but enough. Right on." For a long, taut moment, Crowley's eyes flickered between them. Then he laughed. "Sharp as a whip crack. This ain't over. The law bends for men like me. We just see how strong your little paper marriage is. When I'm through." He turned his horse and galloped off, dust trailing behind him. Emma sank against the doorframe, her knees weak. Dan lowered the rifle, his face carved in stone. "You'll be back," she whispered. "Yes." That night, Emma could not sleep. She lay staring at the beams of the cabin roof, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, the slow rhythm of Don's breathing across the room. At last, she rose and sat by the hearth, the shadows long across her face. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. Dan opened his eyes. He had not been asleep. Crowley is not the first to want what is not his. Emma studied him. In the flickering firelight, he seemed both younger and older, young in the strength of his shoulders, old in the weight carried in his eyes. What did he mean, she asked, when he spoke of court, of the law bending? Dan's jaw worked as though weighing whether to answer. At last he said, "My father built on this land 20 years ago. It raised walls, planted corn, proved the soil. But when the soldiers came, they burned it down, said the papers were lost, said we had no claim." His voice was flat, stripped of anger by years of repetition. Crowley's father was there. It took what he could not earn. Now the son comes to finish the theft. Emma's throat touched. She saw it now, the scar deeper than any wound. Not just one man's struggle for land, but a legacy of betrayal, of erasure. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The son shook his head. "Sorry does not change the past. He looked at her then, sharp and unflinching. But you must understand this is not only survival. This is justice. If I lose this land again, my father's fight dies with me. The fire popped. Sparks leaping like stars. Emma felt the truth settle heavy. She had thought her bargain with him was for shelter, protection, a roof against the desert. But it was more. She had stepped into a battle that had begun long before her, one that would not end easily. In the days that followed, the tension grew. Twice more, Don found signs of strangers near the creek, blueprints, a cigar stub. Once even a scrap of fabric torn on the thorn bush. Emma learned to keep the rifle close. Though her hands shook each time she held it. At night when the coyotes cried and the wind moaned against the walls, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. And yet when she looked at Son steady, unyielding, his presence like bedrock, something in her refused regret. One evening, as they patched the cabin roof, she dared ask, if Crowley comes again, if he brings men, what will you do? Ten set the hammer down, gaze fixed on the horizon. He will stand. And if standing means dying. He looked at her then, and for once the hardness softened just slightly, then I will die where my father lived. But I do not think Crowley expects me to stand with a wife beside me. Emma's heart stumbled again at the word wife. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, then he underestimates you and me. Dan's eyes lingered on her unreadable. Then he returned to his work, but the air between them had shifted. That night, as Emma lay awake listening to the desert's restless whispers, she realized the truth. The bargain they had struck was no longer only about survival. It was about belonging, about choosing to fight, not just for land or name, but for each other. And though shadows from the past gathered on the horizon, Emma felt the first glimmer of strength in her chest, not borrowed, not forced, but her own. The days that followed Crowley's visit felt like waiting for a storm that would not break. The desert lay deceptively calm, sky white and blue. But Dan's every movement carried tension. He kept the rifle loaded, a knife at his belt, his eyes restless on the horizon. Emma felt it, though. When she went to the creek, she swore she heard branches break where no deer moved. At night, the silence seemed too heavy, as if listening. Even the coyotes grew scarce. One evening, Dan returned from scouting the ridges with his jaw tight. 3 men, Crowleys, they were watching. Emma's stomach nodded. What do? We finish the cabin. Make it ready. She looked at him, searching his face. Ready for what? His gaze did not waver. For what? They worked faster than ever. By day, they cut timber, sealed gaps with mud, reinforced the door with heavy beams. By night, they laid supplies near at hand: water, dried meat, ammunition. Emma's hands blistered. Her muscles screamed, but she did not complain. If this cabin was to be their shield, she would build it with her own strength. Ten showed her how to handle the rifle. Patient but firm. Hold it steady. Breathe. Do not fear the kick. It is only wood and iron. The first time she fired, the shot rang wide. Birds burst from the trees. Emma cursed under her breath. Dustin said nothing, only adjusted her grip, his hand steadying hers. On the second shot, the tin can clattered off the fence post. A smile tugged her lips before she could stop it. Dan gave the barest nod of approval. By the end of the week, Emma could load and fire without trembling. She prayed she would never need to, yet some part of her felt strangely proud. She was no longer the helpless girl who had stumbled into the desert. The attack came 3 nights later. The air was dry, the moon a thin sliver. Emma woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought it a dream, but then Ten was at her side, hand gripping her shoulder. Up, he whispered. His voice was calm but urgent. She rose, heart hammering. Smoke curled through the cracks in the wall. Dan eased to the door, peered through the gap. They were here. Emma's chest clenched. How many? 4. Crow lay with them. Through the crack. She saw fire licking at the corral fence. Men carrying torches toward the cabin. Crowley's voice carried on the wind. Burn them out. Ella see his land turned to ash same as his father's. Dan's jaw hardened. He looked at him. Stay low. Do not open the door unless I fall. No. She surprised herself with the word. I won't take away. If this is our fight, it's mine, though. For a moment, their eyes locked. Then gave a short nod. So be it. The first torch hit the wall. Flames crawling up the logs. Then through the door wide, rifle leveled. His shot cracked. The night. One of Crowley's men dropped. Torch tumbling into the dirt. Shouts rang out. Horses screamed. Emma grabbed the water bucket, dousing the fire at the wall. Her arm shook, but she kept moving. Another torch sailed through the window, landing near the bed. She stamped it out with her boots, coughing on the smoke. Outside, the U.S. gunfire split the air. Dasumfired, reloaded, fired again, his movements as sure as breath. Emma knelt beside him, hands fumbling with cartridges. He did not look at her, but when she pressed the rifle back into his grip, his hand brushed hers in brief gratitude. Crowley's voice bellowed through the chaos. Come out, Don. You can't hold against me. The law is mine. The land is mine. Bear nor crawl, it ends tonight. Dan shouted back, voice like stone. This land is my father's, my blood. You will not take it. A shot rang close, splintering the doorframe. Emma flinched but steadied. She raised the second rifle, breathtaked. Through the smoke, she saw a figure rush from the shadows. Torch raised. She aimed, squeezed the trigger. The man fell hard, torch scattering sparks into the dirt. Emma's hands shook, ears ringing, but the cabin still stood. The son glanced at her only for an instant, but in his eyes she saw recognition, not of weakness, but of strength. The fight raged on. Feet licked the walls. Smoke stunned their eyes. At last, Crowley himself charged from the dark, pistol blazing, his face twisted in fury. The sun met him heating, rifle empty but body unyielding. The two men collided, grappling in the dirt, fists and fury under the desert moon. Emma's heart soared. She grabbed the empty rifle, swung it hard against a man who lunged for her. The blow sent him sprawling. She turned just in time to see Crowley drive to the ground, knife flashing in his hand. Your father died with nothing, Crowley spat. And you'll join him tonight, Emma screamed. Without thought, she seized the pistol that had fallen in the dirt, leveled it, and fired. The shot cracked the night. Crowley froze, shock plain on his face, then crumpled beside the flames. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of burning timbers. The last of Crowley's men fled into the dark, their shouts fading into the distance. Dan pushed himself up, chest heaving. Emma dropped the pistol, her hands trembling. He looked at her, eyes fierce in the poor light. You saved me, he said, voice low. Emma swallowed hard, her throat raw. We saved each other. By dawn, the fire was out. The cabin bore scars, walls blackened, roof charred, but it still stood. Emma leaned against the doorframe, exhausted, soot streaking her face. Dan stood beside her, watching the sun rise over the desert. This fight is not done, he said quietly. Crowley had men. Money, others will come. Emma looked at him, her voice steady despite the ache in her body. Then let them. He won't run again. Dan turned, his eyes searching hers. For the first time, the hardness eased, replaced by something deep, unguarded. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, callous palm warm against her skin. In the sense of that burned dawn, Emma knew the truth. What had begun as a bargain had become a bond. Not just a roof, not just survival, but something fiercer, forged in fire. And whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together. The desert dawn after the fire was grey with smoke. The horizon smudged as though the night itself had bled into morning. Emma stood in the doorway of the scarred cabin, her dress singed at the hem, her hands raw from work. She had spent hours stamping out embers, hauling water, and now her whole body trembled with exhaustion. Yet the cabin still stood, charred, broken in places, but standing as she and Dan still stood. Dan returned from the ridge, carrying the rifle across his back. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, strewn with blood and soot. He had gone to be sure the last of Crowley's men were truly gone. He stopped at the threshold, eyes sweeping over the cabin, over her, and then met her gaze. "They won't be back soon," he said. His voice was hoarse but steady. Emma nodded. She wanted to ask how he could be so sure, but she saw the answer in his face. He had lived long enough in this land to know when men were beaten. Crowley was dead. His men scattered. For now they were safe. The word safe felt strange on her tongue. She had not felt it in months, perhaps years. 10 stepped past her into the cabin, running a hand along the blackened wall. "We rebuilt." Emma's throat tightened. She had thought he might speak of leaving, of abandoning this cursed ground for somewhere less scarred by fire and hate. But no, his answer was the same as always. "To stand, to endure," she swallowed. "Yes," she said. "We rebuilt." The days that followed were hung with labor. Together they tore down the worst of the burned beams, patched the roof, and sealed the walls. Emma's hands blistered. Her arms ached. But she worked beside them without complaint. At night, they collapsed on the floor. Too tired even to speak, listening to the desert hum around them. Neighbors from a nearby Apache camp came once, silent and watchful. They brought poles for the roof and left without many words. One old woman pressed a hand to Emma's cheek, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, before walking away. Emma could not guess whether it was blessing or warning. From town came whispers carried by travelers. Crowley's name cursed, his schemes laid bare. Some said he had finally met the justice he deserved. Others muttered that the Apache had murdered him in cold blood. Emma knew the truth, but truth was a fragile thing in the West, bent by power and prejudice. Dan did not chase the whispers. He built. Every log he set, every nail he drove was his answer to the world. And Emma found herself following his rhythm, letting her strength echo his. One evening, weeks after the fire, they sat on the porch newly raised from salvaged wood. The air was cool, the desert stretching gold and red beneath the sinking sun. Emma held the harmonica in her lap, turning it in her fingers. "It almost feels like a home," she said quietly. Dan's eyes followed the horizon. "It is a home. Ours." Her breath caught. The word was plain, yet it carried more weight than any vow spoken by a preacher. Ours. She raised the harmonica to her lips and played a slow tune one her mother used to hum while mending clothes. The notes drifted into the desert air, soft and wistful. When she finished, she found Dason watching her, his eyes unreadable but not unkind. "I had not heard such music since I was a boy," he said. Emma smiled faintly. "I thought perhaps it would remind you of something better." He was quiet a moment, then said, "It reminds me that not all is lost." The words struck her deep. She looked at him. These men of few words who had carried her through a storm, fought beside her in fire, and now built a life from ashes. She realized with a sudden ache that she no longer thought of her year as temporary. "Toussaint," she whispered, "when we first made this bargain, I meant to leave when it was safe when I could." But now her voice faltered and she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Now I find I don't want to." For the first time she saw his expression break, his lips parting, eyes narrowing with something almost like surprise. He leaned closer, his voice low, "And if I ask not for bargain, not for safety, but for truth, would you stay then?" Her heart thudded it. "Yes," she breathed, "for truth." He would stay. He reached slow as dawn and took her hand in his callous fingers wrapped around hers, firm yet gentle. The silence between them was no longer empty, but full of promise of something fragile and fierce. But Saison's turn. The cabin grew solid. A second room added. The fields near the creek cleared for planting. Emma learned to coax beans from the soil, to tend chickens that scratched in the dust. Dan taught her to ride farther, to hunt with bow as well as rifle. The bond between them deepened, unspoken yet she cheered her. When she laughed, rare but bright, he watched with eyes that softened. When he returned from hunting, weary and sunburnt, she set water before him without words. Their lives intertwined like roots beneath the soil. Sometimes in the quiet of night, Emma thought of Missouri, the house with its wide porch, the piano in the parlor, the family that had cast her aside. It felt like another life day. Here in this scared but steadfast land, she had found something she had never known there. Choice. She had chosen this place, chosen this man, chosen herself. The day came when an inspector from the government rode out, ledger in hand. He examined the cabin, the field, the animals. He asked questions, made notes, watched them with the weary eye of a man who measured worth in lines of ink. Then stood tall, Emma at his side. When the inspector asked, "And this is your wife?" Dan's hand found hers steady and sure. Emma lifted her chin. "Yes," she said firmly. "I am." The inspector nodded, scribbled, and closed the book. "Looks like the Blackwood claim is strong. Keep at it, and the land will be yours." When he rode away, Emma released a shaky breath. Dustin squeezed her hand once, then let it go, but the warmth lingered. That evening, they walked to the creek, the sky ablaze with sunset. Emma knelt, trailing her fingers in the cool water. The son stood beside her, silent a long while, then said, "My father dreamed of this, a home, a place that could not be taken. He thought it was lost." Now he stopped as though the words were heavy. Emma rose, her dress brushing the grass. "Now it is found," she finished softly. He looked at her then. The fire of sunset mirrored in his eyes. "Found with you." Her heart swelled. Without thinking, she stepped closer. He bent his head, and their lips met, tentative at first. Then, sure, the kiss carrying all that had been unsaid. All that had been built in silence and fire. When they parted, the desert was still, the sky vast above. For the first time, Emma felt not like a wanderer clinging to scraps of chance, but like a woman rooted in soil she could call her own. Dusan took her hand once more, his voice steady. "We are home." And Emma knew it was true. The cabin, the creek, the desert wide and harsh. It was all theirs. Not given, not borrowed, not begged, but made with sweat, courage, and love that had grown fierce and unshakable. A home of their own. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this.